Hello and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who loves everything about network automation. Today on the show, we continue our conversation with Scott Robohn. Scott has over 30 years of experience in internet infrastructure. In part one of the show, we talked about his background, his perspective, and basically how he got to where he is today. And in today's episode, we're going to dive a little bit more deeper for network automation, him starting his own business, as well as what we all love about network automation with the first, AutoCon conference, the history, the present, and looking into the future. So welcome back to the show, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, so last time when we chatted, we actually talked about your experience at Juniper, becoming from individual contributor into a leadership position leading was it the North America SE org?
Correct.
Yeah. And, obviously move on to other leadership roles and with bigger responsibilities. But then you started to own your own business, right? You started your own business and you talked about having this thought for a long time. So tell us a little bit about that process, because I know that's the aspiration for a lot of people here.
Well, I think this ties to the confidence conversation that we had in the last episode. I've always loved the idea of having my own thing that I've built as far back as, 20 plus years ago. There's a real allure to driving your own destiny.
Yep.
Some of that is real. Some of it is perceived. You have more influence over what you get to do. Like when you build something, you always have customers. You're always accountable to other people. There's no such thing as I can do whatever I want.
Yeah. Just like there's no such thing as purely passive income, right? You're front-loaded the work.
Exactly.
If somebody tell you they're truly passive income, they're probably just lying to you.
Exactly. Well, I finally started getting serious and organized around it around 6 or 7 years back. Really, started putting together here's what I could do from a consulting perspective.
Right.
Almost pulled the trigger in 2019. And I had a crisis of confidence and I got cold feet and I backed out.
And I thank you for saying that, right? Because it's not just all shining and rainbows and unicorns, right? You did
Correct.
have that. You almost pulled the trigger and you backed out.
And it led to a couple other things that I think ultimately were the right things for me to do. And I got some really valuable experience at Nokia and at DriveNets.
Mm-hmm.
But I finally couldn't resist it any longer. In 2022, I really got serious. I worked with my financial advisor to say, okay, here's some revenue models. Here's some resources that I have tucked aside. If I totally flop, how long can I survive? And certainly the plan wasn't to totally flop.
No.
But I feel like there was a huge alignment of the planets, so to speak. And I founded Tech Salescraft January last year and really started doing business under the name early February. It's been great. It's not perfect. My boss is really hard to deal with. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah, you look in the mirror and go, how did I ever come to work for you?
Exactly. Just to give you a real quick, how's it going after a year plus here?
Yeah.
My wife and I were talking the other day. This is like just after I hit the 1 year mark and I didn't even remember. I've been so busy and so focused on NAF stuff, which we will get into.
Yeah. I saw your post, by the way, and I was just, oh, wow, interesting.
Yeah. Boy, I know Ashwin Krishnan, the guy who produces those Standout in 90 Seconds episodes. He's great. And I know him from Juniper. He used to be the big SRX firewall product manager. So she thought about it and said, I think you're thriving. I see you doing all this work. In the past, when you've done it, there's always been a lot of stress around it. Now I see you working just as hard, but without the stress.
Oh, wow.
And that was good external perspective from the one human who knows me the best of everyone in the world.
Right.
To hear her say that in that way was very impactful. And I didn't even think of it that way. So it's going pretty good, Eric. I'll say that.
I love hearing stories like that, right? Because, I've also talked to like Michael Kennedy, for example, he started the Talk Python to Me podcast,
right?
But he grew that in deliberately over a year. So he set up on the calendar on 1 year from today, doesn't matter what happens, I'm going to let go and just do this full time. So he had a deadline to focus on. But at the same time, it's kind of similar to what you said about, you set the worst case scenario, you thought about it and what's the worst that could happen? And you just get that fear out of the way.
Exactly. Yep. No, you got it right.
Yeah. So I know that side of the business, Tech Salescraft is going well and you're thriving, you're enjoying it. So how did that lead to AutoCon? Because that's what, I first heard about your work
For sure.
and start following you online.
So I will admit fully upfront, Network Automation Forum or doing specific work in network automation was not top of mind for me in January 23. And if anything, Tech Salescraft gave me the ability to do lots of other different projects. So if I back up a little bit, I remember somewhere in the fall or winter of 2022, I heard about the State of Network Automation survey just through a post on LinkedIn. Turns out Chris Grundeman was out there soliciting, hey, what's going on for other work that he's been doing? He has his own company that focuses on hearing automation and internet exchange automation, full control.
Sure.
And I said, that's really interesting. I would love to hear the results of the survey. We got connected through common friends and we talked. And we just kind of started asking ourselves, what's the holdup with network automation? Why isn't it taking off? We've been doing this for 20 years, 30 years, depending on how you're counting. And it's just not farther along than we thought it should be.
Let's pause right there. So what's your answer? I'm dying to know. What is your thought on that?
I will say, just like a lot of things with NAF, other people have provided the really good answers. And I will point you to a great blog post from Terry Slattery. Terry's been doing networking forever. He just recently retired, but he heard us, I think, on the very first Packet Pushers interview that Chris and I did regarding NAF. And he said, you guys are talking about the problems, but you're not answering the questions.
Okay.
And he called out, I'm not going to be able to remember all 4 of them, but the first thing he called out was culture change. This is a big culture change issue. We've got a lot of people that hold on to what they do, and it takes very deliberate and directed top-down and or side-to-side agreement that we're going to do things differently. One of the other technical reasons he called out was the lack of architecting for automation, like not considering what does your automation layer and tooling look like in the next gen network design. And he had some other great comments too. But I really have kind of focused on the culture change part, and there's a lot more we can talk to about that. But let's talk more about NAF first.
Yeah, please go for it. I like both of those answers on, the culture change as well as the architectural mindset or the overall picture, because I think those two kind of complement each other. So if you're missing one of them, it's actually a negative feedback loop. You're starting, you don't have a culture, you try to do something, you don't have an overall change. So you do something at a piecemeal just to get by to the next day. And that reinforces into that non-existent culture, right? Like we don't have a plan. So we're just kind of winging it. So if you look at a top-down perspective on establish the culture so that you could tolerate some mistakes, have a roadmap and going forward, which, AutoCon provides a great forum or aggregation of brain trust on how do we change that? How do we establish a culture? How do we get an architecture that everybody could join and contribute to?
For sure. As Chris and I started, thinking about what could we do, right? We basically said we're both entrepreneurs and we don't have to ask anybody's permission. We don't know everything, so let's start talking. Let's vet this idea with some people in our closer circles. And basically in the May timeframe, May 2023, 6 months before the Denver event.
That's amazing too, like short time frame.
You ain't kidding. I don't know how we did it. It was an awesome experience pulling it all together. But we felt like we had vetted the idea and gotten great feedback from enough people to say, there's something to this. There's a hunger out there for more help and encouragement in getting network automation projects moving. Let's get 200 of our best friends together. That was the birth of AutoCon 0. We just kind of set 200 as, if we get 200 people, we'll call that a success. And we had over 340. So we overachieved and we were very, very happy for that. And if you haven't gone and seen any of the material, it's all available on YouTube. Great speakers of names that you'll probably recognize, like Jeremy Schulman, like Kat Grinsky, but others that you probably wouldn't recognize who still brought great things to the table and what they're doing from, driving network automation projects in their individual environments.
The amount of brain power, the amount of knowledge is in that conference is just amazing. People who normally wouldn't be able to share, they jump through many hoops internally just so that they could present their ideas and their knowledge. I know this was the first one, but at the same time, I hope all the ones following, and I know AutoCon 1 is coming up, that could follow that and just, follow that footstep on just share the amount of knowledge that we have. So During the process, was there any surprises, things that you were not expecting? I know you talked about getting 200 of your closest friends, and now
Right.
now 340 showed up, right? So was there any shortage of, I don't know, coffee or bakery?
Everything went extremely well. And I think we did the right things from a planning perspective. We didn't have any deep experience with the logistics of running a conference like this, but we had enough good, smart people around us who had the right experience that really helped us pull it off. And again, it's the delegation thing, right? Can't do it all yourself. Like, I think one of the things that we both walked away from the Denver event was we really would have liked to spend more time dialoguing with people who were at the event. But we had to make sure sponsor tables were going okay, make sure registration was running okay. I had my virtual clipboard walking around. So did Chris, basically making sure nothing was falling apart. And I don't feel like we had any disasters. So there were some good surprises.
I was going to say, yeah, everything actually worked out. Even the weather worked out because November in Denver, kind of a hit and miss, right?
It was great. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. And, I booked a flight and obviously I didn't make it ultimately, but I was worrying like whether it was going to snow out or whatnot, but everything worked out. So that's great. Even the weather.
It was beautiful. And, you're closer to the sun and you can feel it more strongly if you're in the direct sun. There was a great spot where people could hang out in a tent, which was perfect during the day. But here are the positive surprises that I took away. And again, it was great to kind of be forced to reflect on this. The depth of hunger in the community for help with network automation, I knew it was there, but it was stronger and deeper than I think I had an appreciation for before the actual event. That was pretty cool, right? And to see people come together and say, okay, let's share ideas, right? This is not one size fits all. This is something that might work in your environment, but won't work in yours. It was really good that way. In terms of constituencies, of course, they're network engineers and operations folks from their individual, networks and companies, right? Call those the customers. That's one big community that was obvious. The vendors and technology suppliers, that's another community. That's pretty obvious. I was kind of missing a third leg of the stool, and that would be the pro services companies, right? Like Network to Codes, like Cypress Consulting. I have a relationship with Cypress. That's a really important part of bridging the gap between those other two constituencies, right? Coming alongside and helping operations teams, network engineering teams, and having different experience with different vendor infrastructure, but also open source projects and their own tooling that they bring to the table. So it's kind of cool to see that third major group kind of become obvious to me. The third thing I'll call out was the importance of community. And this sounds horribly trite. I hate the way that it sounds, but let me unpack it.
Yes.
This is pretty personal for me because if you go back to, the previous episode and we talked about all the, small org, large org participation things, I remember on day 2 of Tech Salescraft having the thought that, oh, wow, I'm not part of a bigger team anymore. And my propensity would be to panic, at least internally. You probably never see it externally. But I'm very Nordic. I shove my feelings down deep. So I'm pretty good at hiding how I feel. But I didn't panic. And I just had the thought that, well, I guess I'll just have to find other ways to create community and be part of a team. And remember, from a timing perspective, that was before NAF was even an idea for me. And it's been incredible to see how NAF has scratched that itch for me. Like, I feel like I'm part of something that I never was at any given individual corporation. This kind of spans corporate boundaries, and it's really cool to see that. And it's not just NAF, right? There's the U.S. Network User Association, the NUGs. I've gotten to know them quite a bit. We all know NANOG and a lot of the community that's around NANOG. I like this idea of confederation of what's happening, in vendor events, Cisco Live and Cisco Automation Days, versus other vendor-specific events. There's connections here across all these boundaries that are really useful and important. I could ramble on more about this, but I'll pause and just say the community aspect of this has been a huge positive surprise for me.
Are you curious about how AI workloads work on today's network infrastructure? The G-Core engineering team decided to explore this by running an image classification model on their CDN infrastructure. The team tuned a WASM at the edge environment for AI inference workloads. Get the free white paper detailing G-Core's experiment at gcore.com/ Packet Pushers. Once again, that's gcore.com/Packet Pushers. I feel the same way about the podcast as well as the book. Is these are a relationship that goes beyond just the logo that you wear on your chest or the business. I mean, we don't have business cards anymore. I guess LinkedIn title,
Right.
The beyond LinkedIn title. When I know when I left AWS, I felt a part of me was left over there. When I left Microsoft, a part of me, just because
Sure.
the relationship you established there, and you no longer talk to your teammates or your customers, your clients the same way before because your role is now different. But with the podcast and with talking about as well as the other community, open source, that relation persists beyond just any kind of logo. And I think that's what attract people to these communities as well. You come for the technology, but you stay for the tech community.
I totally left out, all the different podcast activities and other things too. Again, it's all part of the system, and it's good to have those multiple sources of info.
For sure. What would you do differently though? So we talked about, the nice surprises that you had. Was there anything that you would have done differently? And now that you discover this explosion of need that you could continue on with AutoCon 1, and I know AutoCon 2 is on the horizon, what would you have done differently so now you have a chance to do something different in AutoCon 1?
So part of me wants to say we should have brought in more help earlier on. We actually have a couple of part-time individuals that are helping us right now for AutoCon 1, and it's been invaluable and so valuable that I don't know how I did it last year. I think if you ask Chris, he'd say the same thing, right?
Yeah.
There's just more work than there are hours in the day, for that. So is it something I would have done different? I guess, because we did do it differently for, AutoCon 1 planning. So we learned from that.
And it's also on the other continent too, right? So it's a little different.
A whole set of different dynamics there. And, we picked Amsterdam for a reason. It's pretty easy for international travel and travel within Europe. It's really, set up well for international business. So hopefully it was a good choice. Others will report on that. Better to hear from others than from what I think of that after the fact.
Yeah, I think by the time we aired this episode, AutoCon 1 would have been wrapped up and we're moving toward AutoCon 2.
Right.
So I would love to hear the listeners' feedback. And, it's kind of a good way for us to get the look back and say, okay, this is what Scott said beforehand. And we'll see the feedback from the listeners as well after. I agree. Amsterdam would be a great choice. And, London, Amsterdam, those are great cities to be the first AutoCon in EU.
Exactly. In terms of other things, I think I would generalize and say there are some other lessons learned that maybe I just haven't figured out how to adapt them yet. On the positive side, partnership is key, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between Chris and myself, he's been incredible to work with. Partnership with the NAF community. We're actually starting to delegate, some things for the event to other people like BOF organization. Jeff Doyle and Ivana Duvniak from Nokia, they're basically handling the BOF structure for Amsterdam.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is like, for me to let that go, it's by necessity. I would still like to have my fingers in it. And that's not a statement of lack of trust in them at all.
Letting go. That was the theme from the first part, right, of our conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The one thing, and I think you probably have some really interesting perspective on this, seeing the amount of fear of automation is really telling. Now, events like the AutoCon events are really self-selecting.
Right.
You're not getting a lot of people there. They're there because they want to learn more.
Right.
But that fear is palpable. AI is only intensifying it. And, I'm still thinking about how to address it. Let me ask you, how do you react to that when people bring this up to you, from a practitioner perspective?
There's always that story of crawl, run, fly, right? So when people have that fear, usually it's something about the confidence level and it's about whether that's going to succeed at the end. If it's 100% going to be successful, there's no fear. It's always that because of that doubt. So to me, it's always digging down deep into pinpoint where that exact fear is. And the problem is sometimes they don't want to tell you or they can't express it in a way that is clear. So digging down, that's always the key, especially from a service industry now that I'm in, is asking questions and asking the right question and kind of reading in between the lines of the words and trying to pinpoint that. We're not always successful. I mean, I'm not always successful in that, but that's what I try to do, just to pinpoint where is that gap and where is that fear rooted. and then go address that. Is it the knowledge? Is it the technology? Is it, you don't see a lot of similar stories out there? That is where I think the NAV could really come to help is, you point at the gaming industry and you say, hey, the biggest gaming industry is doing this. And you point at the financial service industry and say, yeah, the biggest bank in the world have taken these precautions and it worked out for them. So I think that all comes into a circle that way. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
It does. I think any practical tips are useful here, right? I have an impulse to maybe do something more about it academically, like do some research and show what has the real impact of automation been in previous generations of technology and how can we extrapolate or, apply them. This is the impact we expect on network engineering as a field. Is there going to be displacement? Will some people lose jobs? Yeah, you have to be honest and admit that and allow for that. But there's the creation of other roles and work that will need to be done. We see it in micro examples. I don't feel like we've seen it wholesale in the network operations and engineering sector yet. Or maybe I just haven't come across it yet.
I think that's a great idea. And I think that's one of Chris's goal in getting the surveys for the state of network automation, right?
Yep.
It's kind of have these collective temperature check on the industry and on various and just kind of aggregate those data upwards. So the last question I'll ask you about NAV, and we'll try to wrap up part 2, is going forward, what is the plan for NAV? And we already saw some of it putting into forward, but is there like a grand scheme of things that we haven't touched on?
So we're basically settling on 2 major events per year. At least that's what 24 looks like. I think that's the max of what we could do from a major event perspective without really changing our cost structure and bringing on more people. Mm-hmm. That is our notional plan for 24. Mm-hmm. There are things we would like to do, between the events that support the community. This is an opportunity to just bring out one awesome example. There's an individual named Ryan Shaw of Zscaler who has been spearheading the development of a framework for network automation. And let me state very carefully, NAF didn't do this. Ryan spearheaded it, but he brought it into the NAF context for crowdsourcing, for input, for dialogue. And he and one of the other gentlemen he's worked with on this, David Sin, I think his name is, He's in your neck of the woods, right? He's UW, I think.
He and I actually worked together at Amazon, and so he now at UW as well.
So very small world. They did a great Packet Pushers podcast on this. It's like Legos. If you search It's Like Legos, I'm sure you'll see it. I think it's in the heavy networking feed. Mm-hmm. That's a great example of people who have really good ideas for some piece of work in network automation, seeing the broader community basically through NAF Slack, which is open to anybody. Anybody can join our Slack, to really refine the product and get it to a version 1.0. And I would love to see us find more things like that we can, be the wind in the sails, not be the boat or the sail itself. Other things that we have kicked around have been, could we do automation-centric local meetups? That's happening in some places already, right? Right. Is there other useful content we can produce? Is there other specific training we can help facilitate? It really comes down to cycles, right? We only scale so far. We love it, but we also need to be able to feed our families. And so figuring out what the balance is of making it a successful business that really does support the network automation community, that's the intersection that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's a major undertaking just, to have these major conference twice a year. And shout out to Ryan, shout out to David for moving the needle forward. Like you said, this has to be sustainable. And, we talked to the Packet Pusher folks, just a couple of weeks ago, and it does have to be sustainable. And it took them about 8 years to figure out, how to grow this into a real business. So with all of that knowledge and experience and all of the brain power, I'm sure it's going to be awesome. And I look forward to all the events and all the local events coming down. I would love to participate as well. So we're going to wrap up part 2, but stay tuned for part 3 because we're going to dive deeper into the hottest topics of AI and your thoughts on this total network operations. But just to wrap up part 2, where can people follow you and find your work online?
LinkedIn is one of the best places to track me down and connect. Scott Robohn, Robohn. There aren't too many of me, and that should be pretty easy to connect to. You can also, if you go to the NAF page on LinkedIn, you'll also be able to get to me from there as well. I like X. I still use X. I'm Scott Robohn, one word on X. There's still a lot of interesting stuff happening there as far as I'm concerned. So those are the two big places to connect with me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. Do you have any feedbacks for network automation, for Scott, or for this episode? Send us some follow-ups on packetpushers.net/FU. We want to hear from you. Check out our website at packetpushers.net to find other network engineering focused podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, and Slack channels. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.